I'm Ed Adams, and this is the Weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps the new genealogist get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. I'm a kid of the 80s and 90s, and I really love the show X-Files. By today's TV standards, it probably seems a little hokey, but for me it stands up to the test of time. If you've never seen the show, it's basically as much about the paranormal as it is about paranoia. Trust no one is a major theme throughout the 9 years the show was on. People that you thought were on the main character's side end up betraying them, and people who you thought were baddies lurking in the shadows are only kind of baddies and will help the characters from time to time. But the key is this: there are no goodies in the show except for the two main characters, Fox Mulder and Dana Scully. Everyone else is suspect at best. I hope I didn't give any spoilers there, but seeing as the show ended in 2002, I think I'm probably safe. Trust no one is not a great mantra for getting through life, but it has some applicability in historical research. In genealogy, you cannot just trust everything that you see. Every bit of information that you find is a potential lie, error, or simply a lapse in memory. Just because something is written on an old document doesn't make it the truth. Today I want to talk about analyzing your sources to make sure that you know how much stock you can put in all the information you find, and when you find conflicting evidence, how you can determine which source to give more weight to. Think of source analysis as looking through a window at an object. The object is the truth. The source is the window. Your first task is to figure out how many distortions there might be between you and the object. Are you looking through the window, or are you looking at a photograph of a window through which you can see an object? Is there an actual object on the other side of the window, or is it a drawing or picture of an object? Are you looking at any of that, or are you reading a compilation of things that people have seen through windows? I mean, the analogy is really kind of breaking down, but I hope you get the point. Elizabeth Shown Mills has a process map for figuring this out. It centers around 3 elements: the source you're looking at, the information on the source, and what type of evidence that information might represent. Let's start with the source. In genealogy, you deal with a wide range of sources that were all generated for a wide range of purposes. For the purpose of analysis, though, they'll fall into one of 3 categories. They're either original, derivative, or authored. Original sources are exactly what they sound like. So clearly, the World War I draft registration card for your great-grandfather sitting at the National Archives Southeast region at East Point, Georgia, is an original source. But what about the digital image that you brought up on Fold 3 or Family Search? You can safely call it an original source if it's a high-quality scan, and particularly if it's a scan of both sides of the card. In some cases, the digital image of a source can actually be slightly better than getting your hands on the original, as you can do some image manipulation digitally that can improve readability or even bring out things that were previously erased or scratched out that are difficult to do with a true original. The key here is that you're dealing with the source information as it was originally recorded. Derivative sources are attempts to encapsulate the content from the original, but without significant analysis or synthesis from other sources. These are things like transcripts, abstracts, extracts, indexes, or translations if you're dealing with a source that was originally created in another language. The digital textual content that you usually see when you've searched for something on Family Search or Ancestry or basically any other of the sites that are exactly like this, they're all derivative. They may have been created by human indexers, or more commonly now may have been created using AI. Whether it was created by a human or created by a machine, it's useful to keep in mind that this is a layer of obstruction between you and the truth. I can't tell you how many times I have seen the record transcription of something that I've searched for and thought, that can't be right. I know she was born in Nebraska and not North Carolina, only to look at the actual image of the source and find that whoever indexed the document didn't read the handwriting properly and mistook capital N lowercase e for capital N lowercase c. Translations are often very good, but can be misleading, especially if translated by someone who is familiar with the source and target languages, but is unfamiliar with the context of the document being translated. Language is highly contextual, and that context shifts over time. Even when accurate, derivative works, like abstracts, may leave out key information from the original source that would be helpful for your understanding. Authored works are new creations by a writer who consulted numerous original, derivative, and perhaps other authored works, did their own analysis to come to some conclusions, and then produced those conclusions as the authored work. Go into the history section of any bookstore and you'll see the shelves packed full of authored works. Within genealogy, we frequently find ourselves looking at authored works in the form of published genealogies. These are those limited-run books about a particular family or group of families that usually end up in public libraries rather than private bookshelves. These genealogies may have within them derivative works, as they often include appendices that are abstracts or transcriptions of other sources, but when taken as a whole, they're authored works. Authored works are great, and don't turn up your nose at them, but you also have to understand that you are again adding a layer of potential distortion between yourself and the truth. I have not picked up many published genealogies that I could not very quickly identify some errors of assumption in. It's natural anytime you're dealing with something that has significant input from the author as they synthesize information from various different sources. If it were a well-cited genealogy, you can often peel back that layer of authored distortion by looking at the sources the author used so that you can get a better look at that item on the other side of the window. So it's as simple as that, right? Original sources are accurate, and the further away you get from the original, the more likely you are to encounter errors or distortions of the truth. If only it were that simple. The source itself is only one part of the analysis. You also need to look at where the information on the source came from. The second part of the analysis involves determining how much knowledge, or what was the level of participation of the person who provided information on the source, otherwise known as the informant. We classify these informants as either primary or first-hand, secondary or second-hand, or undetermined. This is what makes censuses so interesting in a frustrating kind of way. There's so much information on each census page, and it's so encouraging to get so many answers all in one spot. But you have to stop and ask yourself, who gave this information to the census taker? And the answer for the majority of censuses is, I don't know. Was the head of household at work and the census taker came by so the information was provided by his spouse? Or were both parents at work and an elderly father-in-law was the only one at home? As an experiment, try this. Give your in-laws or even your children a call and ask them, how old am I? Where was I born? Where were my parents born? And how long have I been married? Chances are most of them will get some of that right, but not all of it. In some cases, the information about your ancestors on a census may even have been provided by a neighbor. This is why censuses are almost always undetermined. The 1940 census is a bit of a blessing in that the census taker put a circled X next to the name of the member of the household that they personally spoke with. If a neighbor or other person provided the information, that person's name would be written out to the left. This lets us attribute the information from the 1940 census and put a little more or a little less emphasis on it based on the proximity of the source. Other sources make this much easier. For example, most certificates of death will specifically state who the informant for the document is, and some will even list multiple informants, one for the administrative data about the deceased and then one for the medical information about the deceased. So if you're looking at a certificate of death, and the informant is the deceased's spouse, and it lists the deceased as having been born in Illinois, does that mean that we have primary information regarding the birth of the deceased? No. Unless the spouse was present at the deceased's birth, which, although I suppose possible, would be highly unlikely, a wife's attribution of her husband's place of birth will only be a secondary or second-hand. She would have gotten that information from someone else because she most likely wasn't there. So what about those World War I draft cards I spoke of earlier? Although it doesn't state explicitly on the source document itself, we know from reading the description of the source that the information provided on those documents was provided by the named individuals. So if you see that your great-grandfather said he was born in Illinois on his draft card, does that mean that we have a primary account for his place of birth? No. While your great-grandfather was certainly present at his birth, giving him that level of participation that we're looking for, unless he was truly unique among our species, he has no actual memory of his birth, meaning that his understanding of his own birth information is actually secondhand, likely learned from his mother, who was most decidedly there and knowledgeable. Going back to the certificate of death, while the birthplace is secondhand information, the cause of death can be seen as primary information because the informant, typically the attending physician, would have been the one who determined the cause of death. As the originator of that bit of information, he or she provided primary information. So a source is not a primary source or a secondary source. Information on the source is, and some documents will have a mixture of primary, secondary, and undetermined information. The final bit of Mill's process map talks about understanding which type of evidence you're dealing with. We've talked about evidence in a previous episode, but to summarize, your evidence is either direct, indirect, or negative. Direct evidence makes a specific assertion as to the answer of a research question that you have. Indirect evidence can be used with other indirect evidence to make a sound conclusion with regards to your research question. And negative evidence is the evidence of absence, or the information whose absence is telling in some way. If you want more about analyzing your evidence, go check out episode 7, Types of Evidence. I'll have a link in the description. So let's say I'm on a mission to learn about the marriage date of two of my maternal great-grandparents. I find a family Bible that has a date for the marriage of the two, something that I thankfully actually do have. Let's do some quick analysis of this using the Evidence Explained process map. It's a family Bible, meaning that while it's an old document, it's a derivative document, certainly as it pertains to the information about the date of marriage. The original document would be the marriage certificate. The information in the Bible was given by my maternal great-grandmother herself based on a note in the margin, so that makes the marriage date primary or first-hand information. And given that my research question is about the marriage date, that makes it direct evidence. So, I've got a derivative source with primary information that gives us direct evidence as to the marriage date of my great-grandparents. I'm done, right? I can add that bit to my family information sheets, right? Well, that's up to you. In an effort to achieve the first genealogical proof standard, conduct reasonably exhaustive research, I'm going to try to hunt down that marriage certificate or marriage license or any other source that will make a direct, indirect, or negative assertion on the topic. What you may find once you've assembled all those multiple sources is that your great-grandmother may have put an older date in the family Bible to conceal from her descendants that her first child was conceived prior to the wedding. You see similar issues with men reporting their ages inaccurately to either make themselves eligible or ineligible to serve in the military during times of conflict. Along with understanding where the information in a source came from, you also need to understand what motivations the informant may have had to provide incorrect information, which again goes back to understanding the source and what the purpose of the document is. This sort of thing happens frequently, and if you want to know the truth, you're going to need to go beyond that first source that has an answer for you. So just like Agent Mulder, you may want to believe, but you must also trust no one and do your due diligence to determine that the truth is out there. If you haven't, I really recommend that you watch The X-Files. It's a great show, but I hope you're starting to feel that analyzing your sources is something that you can do. It's one of the biggest differences between the hobbyist and the serious genealogist. Once you get comfortable viewing your sources with suspicion, you'll start to see long-assumed truths that you can start proving false. If you've learned something today that you feel is helpful, I'd love for you to reach out to me on Twitter @TheWGTPod. If you're really enjoying the podcast, please leave a review. Now, get on with your research. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.